Hi, I'm Derek Downey, and welcome to Tarot and Human Development, where I'm exploring self-development in the Western mystery tradition. In this video, I'll be reading my article, Occult Symbolism in M83's new album, Fantasy. So whereas the rest of the videos on my channel so far have been very tarot-specific, I would say this one is more tarot-adjacent. I'm going to be talking about ideas within the Western mystery tradition, which are also imbued all throughout the tarot cards. However, I won't be naming the tarot cards in specific. So the way this article is going to work is I'm going to cover two of the symbols in depth. One, which is water, which is referenced throughout the album, and then the other one is the deeper end, or the depths. So I'm going to cover those two in detail, and then at the end, I'm going to do a rapid fire where I cover all of the tracks and quickly throw out all the different occult symbols or interpretations I sensed. So I'll have the timestamps to those if you would like to just skip to that as well. So I start with a disclaimer here that says, I'm not saying that Anthony Gonzalez, the singer and songwriter of M83, I'm not saying that he wrote this album to very specifically express the ideas of the Western mystery tradition. I'm instead saying that the symbols that he uses in this album are also symbols that are used in the Western mystery tradition, and so I'm going to interpret the lyrical contents using the ideas from the Western mystery tradition. So I'm going to start at defining occult symbols. Before we can talk about occult symbols, I should first define the word occult. When most people hear the word occult, images may come to mind of pentagrams, witchcraft, Satanism, and so on. However, the word occult simply means hidden from view. In fact, the word occultation is still used in astronomy today to describe when one celestial body blocks our view of another celestial body. I think it's fair to say that the opposite of the word occult is the word visible. Another word frequently used alongside occult is the word esoteric. The Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines esoteric as designed for or understood by the specially initiated alone. The opposite of esoteric is exoteric with an X, which is defined as suitable to be imparted to the public. The Latin root eso means inside or inner, while the Latin root exo means outside or outer. That's why we refer to the hard outer shell of an insect as its exoskeleton. We're essentially saying the skeleton is on the outside of the body. So a perfect example of something that is both occult, or hidden from view, and esoteric, which means inner or inside, is a dream. When you look at someone asleep and dreaming, all you see is a physical body with its eyes closed. Maybe they're blinking with the rapid eye movement. Their dream is something completely hidden from your view and happening inside their consciousness. Similarly, our imagination is another occult tool accessible to us and us alone. You can't show your imagination to anyone else. You can only use your words or create artwork to attempt to describe it. A relevant M83 lyric here is from track 6, the song Radar Far Gone, where he says, "You don't have to show your face. We only look inside, you see." The Western occult traditions, whether it's Kabbalism, alchemy, Rosicrucianism, Gnosticism, and so on, have focused on two themes. The first theme is exploring the hidden forces within us that are either dormant or unconscious. So the hidden forces meaning they are things that are not so obvious to people living in the physical world. You could say that psychology itself is a study of the hidden forces, of the unconscious mind at play. Our belief systems, what we believe in, would be considered a hidden force. You can't point to it, but it definitely has an impact on the way you act in the world and the way you view the world. So that first theme is the study of these hidden forces themselves. However, according to Dion Fortune in her book, The Mystical Kabbalah, simply being able to sense these hidden forces only makes someone a psychic, not an occultist. In order to become an occultist, we must learn how to work with these forces. Thus, a second theme of the occult traditions is the study of how a human being, through the use of symbols and practical rituals, can attain new levels of consciousness, which ultimately results in a better understanding and control of the world both inside us and outside of us. In one of her lectures, Reverend Ann Davies of the Builders of the Adytum described this journey to expand our consciousness as the, quote, climbing of Jacob's ladder. This is a reference to the Bible passage in the book of Genesis, chapter 28, verse 12, where Jacob falls asleep, quote, and he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. This is also apparently referenced in the M83 lyric in track 4, named Us and the Rest, where he says, hello, freak, can you see the sky ladder? But why would the M83 lyric use the term freak? Perhaps it is because the majority of humans are so busy on the physical plane of manifestation, the exoteric plane, that they do not look for the sky ladder, which exists on the esoteric plane. Therefore, the person who decides to turn inward and seek spiritual ascension becomes, by definition, the oddball of the group, a freak. I'm reminded of verse 23 in the Gospel of Thomas, where Jesus said, I shall choose you 1 out of 1,000, and 2 out of 10,000, and they shall stand as a single one. In other words, the esoteric awakening is not something that's going to happen to all people in the world. That's part of why it's considered a secret. It's not because people can't know about it. It's that most people are too busy in the physical world to even recognize it. To summarize, occult symbols are the symbols and metaphors that have been passed down through Western esoteric literature and organizations, intended to help people attain a better understanding of the hidden forces that affect us, with the ultimate goal of an expansion of consciousness. All that being said, let's look at the symbols. Occult symbol number 1, water. One common set of symbols in the occult tradition is the 4 classical elements of fire, water, air, and earth. From a physical sciences perspective, or an exoteric, obviously visible to the public perspective, these 4 elements can be seen as the 4 stages of matter. Solid, which would be earth, liquid, which would be water, gas, which would be air, and plasma, which would be fire. However, from an esoteric or inside perspective, these 4 elements have been used as symbols and metaphors for all sorts of philosophical and psychological concepts. The element of water is referenced in M83's fantasy through the song titles Water Deep, Ocean's Niagara, and Earth to Sea. So what are some of these metaphorical esoteric meanings of the word water? The first is water as the unconscious mind. As Carl Jung wrote, water is the commonest symbol for the unconscious. The lake in the valley is the unconscious, which lies, as it were, underneath consciousness, so that it is often referred to as the subconscious, usually with the pejorative connotation of an inferior consciousness. Psychologically, therefore, water means spirit that has become unconscious. So in other words, the unconscious, we refer to it as the subconscious because sub means below. So we're basically saying the things that are below consciousness, which means below our awareness. You could say consciousness and awareness are the same things. So when he says water means spirit that has become unconscious, spirit can be thought of as energy, force, expression. So spirit that has become unconscious means the energy or forces, the hidden forces that are being expressed within us that we are not aware of. We are unconscious of them. The metaphor of water as the unconscious mind makes sense when you think about it. When you look out at a body of water, you can't easily see underneath the surface. Likewise, when we look into our unconscious mind, we can't easily see what's going on in our unconscious mind because it is, by definition, unconscious. It is outside of our awareness. If we were aware of it, it would be our conscious mind. Thus, the unconscious represents all of the monsters and treasures lurking beneath the surface of our conscious mind. So I call out monsters and treasures here because it's important to note that when Freud started with psychology and the unconscious, he described the unconscious as this awful cesspool of human tendencies that are destructive and dangerous, monsters of our nature that we had to suppress. And if we didn't suppress and repress them, then we could not live as a society, and civilization as we knew it would collapse. So he saw the unconscious as entirely filled with monsters. However, we also know nowadays that it's filled with treasures. It is a source of energy to us. So if we can work with the unconscious mind, we become more powerful and we can live an authentic life, as Carl Jung would say. This is why the occult traditions have long referred to the unconscious mind as, quote, the Great Sea. You'll see that term throughout, the Great Sea. Water as the emotions. From the water as unconscious mind metaphor naturally arises the water as emotions metaphor. This is said to be why Venus, who represents our instinctual and emotional nature, was born out of the sea. I can't find the exact quote anymore, so if someone could help me out and post it in the comments, that would be great. I heard this from Aleister Crowley, and I heard it referenced to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, that they described when a body of water is troubled and waves are crashing about, then the solar disk of the sun becomes fragmented and reflects sporadically across the water's surface. The goal of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn was to help aspirants bring the body of water to a calm stillness so that they may more clearly perceive the disk of the sun in its whole form, unbroken and pure. In other words, once we calm the turmoil of our emotions and we bring our emotional self to a peaceful stillness, then and only then can we begin to accurately see and connect with our higher self or our spiritual nature. Water as intuition. In his book, The True and Invisible Rosicrucian Order, Paul Foster Case wrote, "Occult water is something characterized by fluidity, by wave-like motions, by the formation of currents, tides, and whirlpools, and by its tendency to run downhill, that is, from higher to lower levels of expression. It is sometimes called astral fluid, and sometimes first matter." There's two takeaways from this passage that I'd like to focus on. The first is water's tendency to run downhill, which aligns with Jung's observation of the lake forming in the valley of the landscape. Water is associated with intuition, because again, intuition is something that arises out of the unconscious mind. Intuition can be thought of as a downward flowing of insight from a higher level of spiritual consciousness into our lower level of observing self consciousness. Water also has a receptive quality to it because, unlike dirt or stone, you can jump into a body of water and go swimming. You can't jump into dirt, jump into stone. Thus, water represents both the reception and the downward flow of intuition. Water as imagination. The second takeaway from the Paul Foster Case quote above is the one most relevant to M83's album Fantasy, which is water as the astral fluid of our imagination, or our fantasies. But what is astral fluid? Here's a little thought experiment to help you understand. Close your eyes and envision a door with as much visual detail as you can. What color is the door? What shape is the door? What material is it made out of? According to Western occultism, that door pictured in your mind is happening in the astral plane. And that door is made out of a substance that is called by many names, including astral fluid. If physical matter is the stuff that physical things are made out of, then astral fluid, or astral matter, or first matter, is the stuff that imaginary things are made out of. This imaginary stuffness is associated with water, because just as water freely changes its own shape to match the shape of the cup it's poured into, so does the stuff of our imagination change its shape to fill the mental form we create with our mind. Whereas materialistic mindsets and sciences tend to ignore the imagination, imagination is the foundation of the occult traditions. This is why Alan Moore in Promethea associates imagination with the Kabbalistic Sephirah of Yesod, which is the Hebrew word for foundation. So Alan Moore says that imagination is the foundation of all spirituality. In Carl Jung's words, fantasy is not nothing. It is, of course, not a tangible object, but it is a fact nevertheless. Fantasy is, you see, a form of energy, despite the fact that we can't measure it. It is a manifestation of something, and that is reality. This brings me to occult symbol number 2 in M83's album Fantasy, the depths. I start with a quote from track 5, Earth to Sea, where he says, "I heard of a legend where the others go." And then later he says, "To the living dreams, I think I'm falling into the deeper end." Where things start getting really interesting is when we realize that within this inner realm of our imagination, there exists a life force with its own seemingly autonomous nature, operating totally outside of the control of our conscious thinking mind. Carl Jung named this the spirit of the depths. The most obvious example of this autonomous life force is dreaming while asleep. How many times have you woken up from a dream and went, "Well, that was weird"? Did you feel like you consciously sculpted that dream experience? Or did you feel like it was given to you? Dreams are a great example of an experience delivered to you from the deep end of your unconscious. However, we don't have to fall asleep in order to allow our autonomous unconscious mind to express itself. For example, close your eyes one more time and reimagine that same door from before. Take a few moments to bring it into visual clarity. Something is inscribed above the door. What does it say? Now, open the door. What do you see? In that example, did you consciously come up with the inscription above the door and the contents behind the door? Or did they just kind of appear? If nothing really came to mind, then it's worth pointing out that just like learning a new language or learning how to ride a bike, learning how to allow the depths to express itself to your conscious mind is a skill that takes practice. In her book, The Mystical Kabbalah, Dion Fortune describes this process from a Kabbalistic viewpoint in the passage below. Please note that in this passage, I believe Hod refers to the conscious thinking mind, Netzach refers to the unconscious mind, Yesod refers to the realm of imagination, and astral light is another term for astral fluid or astral matter. The functioning triangle of the lower triad consists of Hod, Netzach, and Yesod. Hod and Netzach, as we have noted before, are respectively form and force on the astral plane. Yesod is the basis of etheric substance, Akasha, or the astral light, as it is variously called. Hod is especially the sphere of magic, because it is the sphere of the formulation of forms, and it is therefore the sphere in which the magician actually works, for it is his mind that formulates the forms, and his will which makes the link with the natural forces of the sphere of Netzach that ensoul them. In other words, if the conscious mind builds up a form in the imagination, the unconscious mind can ensoul it and bring it to life. Said yet another way, using the symbolism from the book of Genesis, if the conscious mind sculpts a form using the dust of the imagination, out of the dust of the imagination, the unconscious mind can then breathe the breath of life into it, turning it into a living being. Carl Jung called this conscious exploration of autonomous fantasies from the depths, he called this active imagination. Notice how in order for it to be active imagination, there must be a component of consciousness involved. When we dream and do not consciously interact with or reflect upon that dream, we do not explore the depths. Active imagination can only happen through the interacting of both the conscious and the unconscious mind. It's when both are present. Lucid dreaming is very similar to active imagination. However, lucid dreaming means you've fallen asleep and you become conscious during your dream. Whereas active imagination is more you're awake and you kind of drift into an intense daydream. A perfect example of the powerful results that can come from this blending of the conscious and the unconscious mind is Napoleon Hill's imaginary council meetings, as he described in chapter 14 of his book, Think and Grow Rich. So I have a quote from that chapter, which he said, "The procedure was this. Just before going to sleep at night, I would close my eyes and see, in my imagination, this group of men seated with me around my council table. Here I had not only an opportunity to sit among those who I considered to be great, but I actually dominated the group by serving as the chairman." Here we can see that although Hill allowed himself to drift into his imagination, into his daydream, he retained his conscious mind by placing it as chairman of the group. So he still had control of the group. His conscious mind was still interacting with the unconscious beings. This group of men he interacted with was 9 people he admired most, including people like Abraham Lincoln, Ralph Waldo Emerson, and Charles Darwin. He said his original purpose for this experiment was to, quote, rebuild my own character so that it would represent a composite of the characters of my imaginary counselors. However, and I have another quote here, after some months of this nightly procedure, I was astounded by the discovery that these imaginary figures became apparently real. Each of these 9 men developed their own personalities, their own habits, their own preferences, and began to say frighteningly profound things in their council meetings, things that Napoleon Hill felt were not coming from his conscious mind. In fact, at one point, the meetings became so realistic that Hill discontinued the practice for several months, fearing for his sanity. Hill concludes with this passage. My original purpose in conducting council meetings with imaginary beings was solely that of impressing my own subconscious mind through the principle of autosuggestion with certain characteristics which I desired to acquire. In more recent years, my experimentation has taken on an entirely different trend. I now go to my imaginary counselors with every difficult problem which confronts me and my clients. The results are often astonishing, although I do not depend entirely on this form of counsel. So he'll take his problems to this imaginary counsel, and I think it's interesting to point out this is the difference, again, getting back to what I mentioned earlier of a psychic versus an occultist. The occultist has this active component where the conscious mind is actually interacting with these unconscious forces, and it's the mixing of those two together that causes this alchemical result. In other words, the imaginary forms, or the counselors, sculpted by Hill's conscious mind, eventually became ensouled by the spirit of the depths, becoming seemingly alive and autonomous beings, capable of providing information and insight to him, which he felt his conscious mind could not come up with on its own. Perhaps the deeper end, alluded to in M83's album Fantasy, are these depths, where your fantasies and imagination begin to act on their own, out of their own autonomous nature. So that wraps up my lengthy elaborations on the two symbols of water and the depths. For the rest of this video, I'm going to quickly do a lightning round where I run through the remaining symbolism that I detected throughout the album. Track 3, Amnesia. This track could be interpreted as a soul reincarnating back into physical manifestation, where there is darkness and sadness. Darkness is something typically associated with the earth, because the earth also represents ignorance. In ancient Greek mythology, there was a river of forgetfulness in Hades. According to Wikipedia, souls were made to drink from the river before being reincarnated, so that they would not remember their past lives. In other words, the souls would experience amnesia. So possibly track 3 is about the amnesia experienced right before the soul incarnates into the physical world. Track 5, Earth to Sea. While I already discussed the concept of the sea at length, representing the imagination and the unconscious mind, the concept of earth in the occult traditions represents the physical, external, visible, material world. Thus, the idea of earth to sea could represent the journey from the outer physical world into the inner imaginary world, from the exoteric to the esoteric. Track 7, Deceiver. In this song, the distant writer who writes the singer's destiny could be thought of as a person's higher self, soul, or holy guardian angel, the higher being that incarnates into this world with a destiny. Another interpretation of the distant writer could be the cosmic source of universal consciousness, which all individual units of consciousness are just extensions of. Track 8, Fantasy. Living in a fantasy can be related to the idea of conscious exploration of the unconscious through the imagination, as explored throughout this article. Track 9, Laura. This is a dense one. This song sounds like a conversation between an individual unit of consciousness, the male voice, and the great cosmic mother, the female voice. In Kabbalah, The Cosmic Mother is associated with Sephira 3, named Bina. And Bina is associated as the giver of form. She is like, just like how a human mother in the physical world gives birth to a child, the Cosmic Mother is the cosmic force that gives birth to all forms in the world. So in the track Laura, they also mention the night sky. In Aleister Crowley's Thelema, which is inspired by ancient Egyptian mythology, the night sky is associated with the sky goddess Nuit, always depicted as wrapping her body over the earth. Crowley also declared in Thelema that every man and every woman is a star, a concept reinforced in the lyrics of this song when the Great Mother voice says to the unit of consciousness, "There's no distance in the soul. You are a limitless star." Track 10, Sunny Boy. These lyrics sound like they could be about uniting opposites through the reconciliation of the male and the female, a theme very prevalent throughout Western alchemy. In Arthur Edward Waite's tarot card for the Lovers, you'll see a male, Adam, and a female, Eve, under an angel. According to people like Paul Foster Case, this card represents a union of the self-conscious thinking mind, the male, with the subconscious feeling mind, the female, which together allows for the expression of the superconscious higher mind, the angel. In this song, the female voice, or the subconscious mind, is asking if the male voice, the conscious mind, has ever believed in cosmic adrenaline, dancing, kissing, all things that incite and inflame the emotional chemistry of the human vehicle. In this song, the self-conscious is falling in love with the subconscious. Track 11, Kool Nuit. As mentioned earlier, Nuit is the ancient Egyptian goddess of the starry night sky. However, it's also just the French word for night, so take that with a grain of salt. A big theme in Western alchemy is the marriage of the sun and moon. I think it's cool that the last track has the word sun in its name, and then the next track has the word night in its name. It's like you get the day and night. In this track, the female voice describes herself, in French, as daughter of the fire and wind. With this, all four of the classical elements, fire, water, air, and earth, were referenced in this album. That line also reminds me of the Hermetic Emerald Tablet, which, when it's talking about how to create the Philosopher's Stone, it says, "The sun is the father. The wind carries it in its stomach." So here you have the sun representing the fire, and then the wind representing the air. Track 13, Dismemberment Bureau. If Amnesia is about a soul reincarnating into manifestation, this track is about that soul disintegrating back into the spiritual realm. Very Pisces. The male voice of the individual soul seems to say that it will carry its wants and its love until the end of time, kind of implying that it will reincarnate with those same wants and loves. While the female voice of the Cosmic Mother alludes to how human incarnation is such a good way for the soul to learn. This corresponds to the popular idea that our souls manifest into the world in order to learn certain lessons. And once we die, if we did not learn all the lessons that we came here to learn, then our souls will drink again from that river of forgetfulness and reincarnate back into physical manifestation over and over again until we learn what we must. The idea of Dismemberment Bureau also reminds me of Crowley's idea of Choronzon, who is the being on the threshold who destroys forms attempting to pass into the higher realms. I think it's also worth pointing out that this is track number 13 on the album, and in tarot cards, Major Arcana number 13 is the Death card. So those have been some of my personal occult interpretations of the symbolism throughout the lyrics of M83's new album, Fantasy. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, I don't know what was going through his mind. I only know what went through my mind when I listened to the lyrics. Hope you enjoyed it. Thanks. See you next time.